This is Roll Call for this edition of African Drums. The African drums are sounding.
Good evening. Welcome to African Drums, the television organ of the Cuffy250 Committee, an organization dedicated to the empowerment of the African Guyanese community through education and the encouragement of self-activity. I am Elsie Harry, and I will be your host for this evening's program. The recent debate over identity in Guyana has taken on a life of its own. While many have argued that ethnic pride is a hindrance to national unity and identity, others have contended that there is no tension between one's ethnic and civic identities. As a Black conscious organization, Cuffy250 comes down on the side of the latter. We contend that the apparent decline in African Guyanese cultural pride has weakened that group politically, economically, and in other areas of national life. The restoration of African Guyanese cultural pride is therefore pivotal to the future of African Guyanese and Guyana. On today's program, we examine this in its broadest sense with a panel of cultural workers. Mr. Tom Dalgety is a long-standing Africanist and cultural worker. Mr. Eric Phillips is a member of ACDA and a tireless worker of African Guyanese empowerment. Gentlemen, welcome to African Drums.
Thank you.
And for you, Mr. Phillips, it's welcome back.
Yes.
Okay, let us start with a broad question. Is there tension between one's ethnic or cultural identity and one's civic or Guyanese identity? Mr. Dalgety, you can begin.
Conflict between cultural identity and civic identity. For me, I wouldn't separate the two. I thought of this cultural identity matter, and actually I want to bring in with an example. When I was about 10 years old, there was a Elsie, a Nigerian king who came to Guyana, and it was the first time somebody of royal blood came to Guyana. Previously, we've had Catholics, we have had the British royalty, we've had Indian potentates coming to Guyana, and for the first time, an African came. Now, as a result of that, lots of people felt so happy about it in terms of their identity with Africa that many began to name their children Elsie after Elsie who arrived here. There was another example that I could think about in terms of cultural identity and the matter of restoring our this identity was a visit of Ali Masui, an academic who came to Guyana for a celebration in the 1980s. And he filled up the whole cultural center. Now, again, Guyanese are so happy and proud, the Afro-Guyanese, I should say, so happy and proud that they went out of the way to attend. And those things, I think, for me, the matter of exchanges, let us say, on visits by Africans and exchanges between here is essential in terms of what I would like to see in opening about our cultural identity.
Okay. Mr. Phillips?
I think there is. We see people trying to whiten their skins. In essence, not wanting to be African because it's perceived to be inferior. We've come out of a period where Africans were perceived to be at the bottom of the ladder. And indeed, the political system was one of Indian domination. So you saw many Africans trying to become more Indian or African or something else. And they tried to move away from their Africanness. So their self-esteem became an issue If you were to wear this on the street, other than during August or Emancipation, they would look at you strange. So there was this sense that being African in Guyana was being inferior. Now, in reality, and I come down on the same side as Cuffy250, your ethnic being should not be in conflict with your national being or your civic being. And we have to reconcile that. A lot of people say that we have lost our Africanness. But I don't understand that, because I'm African and my culture is myself. So I think that currently we've seen what has happened in terms of people being afraid to be African, but I think now you'll see people start to rebalance that.
Okay. Oh, you had something to say?
Well, you
Sure.
know, in terms of feeling the people being feeling that, about Africans and so, I would say that over the years that I have been watching at this matter, you know, around about the 70s and 60s, I have Guyanese friends who changed their names to be the African names, you know, many of them. And therefore I don't think that it prevented them from being Guyanese, but they certainly, by changing their names, was proclaiming their Africanness.
But that's the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
I'm talking about today. How many people name their children with African names? Very few. People are going Rastafarian, but instead of being spiritual Rastafarian, it's a lifestyle. But, you know, I think we have moved away from liking ourselves. The environment has told us that we're not nice people. You look at how crime is reported. You look at the white people using things to change their skin. And I think that's all a reflection of us being afraid to be African.
But why do you think that people feel like they need to choose between being African or being Indian and being Guyanese?
Because the society was telling them. But if you're African, if you're saying you're African, you're racist in a sense, because you don't want to buy into this view of one people, one nation, one destiny. Now, so if I'm going to buy into that view of being a Guyanese, then I should be an equal Guyanese. Resources shouldn't be going to other groups, or they shouldn't be benefiting more than me, and then you want me to be equal. If you want me to be equal, and if you want me to be Guyanese first and African second, then let me be equal to everyone else.
Of course, I subscribe to that equality thing, and in fact, you see, the situation is dynamic. He did mention my reflections in the 1970s and so on, and what is happening now, and the dynamics changed with the politics, I would say. I mean, for example, one of the cultural values that was preached or we tried to embrace in the in the first Bonham era, for example, is that of being a non-racial people. Okay, Bonham basically led us with what I call 4 values: self-help, self-reliance, cooperatives, and non-racial. And then when it changed in the 1990s, we had this move towards racism and whatnot, which, in a sense, I will then agree with him that, in fact, it became racial. And I know there was one comment where I think Dr. Chagan mentioned that at the bottom of the ladder. Okay, but I don't think we gave up hope on it, you know, and it's because of those the value of hope, let us say. It made us feel that we were not necessarily inferior to anybody. And this is why, in fact, you saw what took place, the recent phenomena of the partnership coalition. So that we have to think of this in terms of the dynamics of a period.
Let me give you one other example.
Sure.
We have a school at Agda. We have about 90 students. When we started out, we had about 20. And everybody kept saying it's an African school, it's inferior. Even though our curriculum was the same as the national curriculum, but it was embellished with a lot of African images, self-pride, those types of things. Our first exam, we sent 7 students. We averaged 88 at a national grade 2. The school doubled. So instead of giving us the benefit of the doubt that we are equal, it was an inferior school because it was an African school. And that's how the society thinks. And unfortunately, we ourselves as Africans bring ourselves down because we're the ones, I don't want to send my child to Agda. When we have a superior program, we have 15 students to teacher. Where else can you find that? We have a computer lab. Where else can you find that? We have retired head teachers. Where can you find that? We're subsidizing our students. We have a shade garden. We have cultural lessons. But it's an African school, therefore it's inferior.
Okay. In a case like that, for example, the school at Agda with the curriculum being embellished with African symbols and teaching African pride.
And wearing an African uniform every day.
Yeah, I see there what the cultural identity that is attached to the school does for the students. But what do you think that the civic identity does for those people that don't want their children to go to Agda, that their cultural identity cannot do for them?
Well, you have to put it in context. Everyone wants the best for their children.
Correct.
And it was perceived that if they went somewhere else other than Agda, it would be better for their children. That's their perception. The reality is different. And I think...
But better in terms of what? Explain for our viewers, what is this notion of better?
For example, most of my life I've been in the business world. As a matter of fact, I've run businesses bigger than any businessman in Guyana. But I am not seen as a businessman. I'm seen as an African who's pushing African rights. When the reality is, the companies that are here are 1/50 to the size of the companies I've run. So again, it's the perception of African and the school and not being good enough and not being able to compete and all of that.
Okay.
But I mean, I haven't been around the Agda and know the reality of Agda. But it is true that that within the last years or so, there was this problem of being under pressure in a political sense. You know, that some people did feel that maybe sending the child to an African school would have given them
the disadvantage.
A disadvantage, okay? But on the other hand, and in fact, when you look at some of the results in at the CXC exam, you know, you sometimes get that impression, okay? But you know, for example, this year I think Mr. Success got a lot of a good result, and I would think that I think there was even an Indian guy who went to Mr. Success's school. You understand what I mean? And this was in fact a black man. So you're seeing where sometimes once somebody is perceived as being outstanding, then whether you're Indian or black or Indians or whatever it is, you probably will send the child there.
But there's a Hindu school that's doing extraordinarily well over the river. They're Catholic schools, right? They're Christian schools. They don't get the same haggle as an African school. And that's because the perception is something different. It's not that we're not perceived as being equal, regardless of the fact that we are. And those are the spaces and the nuances in our society. I mean, you see our kid going to Agda with an Agda uniform like this, saying, poor kid, he's not going to be as bright as the other.
Okay, so you would say that from these things that you've seen that cultural pride in the African Guyanese community has declined.
It has been squeezed in such a way, Africans have been oppressed in such a way that they've lost self-esteem. Because they look at all of the role models, all of the business people, they're led by Indians. Whether they're qualified or not, they're led by Indians. I mean, there was I guess in the newspaper, one of these, I guess, who's his name? The guy who does all these caricatures. Oh. And he showed 9 leaders, and they were all Indians. And that was the reality. If you were to look over the last 10 years, whether you're Clive Thomas, the most preeminent economist in the Caribbean, never got a call from the last government.
But that's politics. That's not
no.
That I wouldn't say.
But precisely. So if you're African, you're not worthy.
No,
And therefore, our kids didn't see any role models to say, "Oh, I want to be a Clive Thomas," because he disappeared.
Perhaps Mr. Dalgety is saying that's because of his political persuasion, not the color of his skin. Why?
You know, well, to some extent, because I think everybody knows Clive Thomas. And
But why
his
wasn't he
excellent-
called?
Huh?
Why wasn't he called?
Well,
Clive is
you know,
almost in his 80s.
it is,
His
yeah.
best years, the last 23 years.
Mm-mm.
He was not asked to contribute to our national development. The best economist in the entire Caribbean.
Okay, well, how do we fix this situation?
But, for me, for me to fix this situation, well, first of all, there's been a political change that has taken place, which, as I said, that because of certain values within the African community or so, I mentioned one that we never gave up hope, and therefore, whether they thought that we were at the bottom of the ladder or not at the bottom of the ladder, and the fact is we had this. I mean, for example, I'm just reflecting that, for example, Obama published a book that speaks about the audacity of hope. And it is this audacity that I think you find in our society also, that made us not believe that we were necessarily at the bottom of the ladder. I mean, I certainly don't believe I'm at the bottom of the ladder. Okay, and so that the way in which we resolve these matters is a challenge. I think there's. I'm reflecting something else now. The loss of probably self-esteem in the service industries. Now that he mentioned teaching, or at the school, they might have been so also in the nursing profession, in the medical profession, and so on and so forth. Okay, and we'll discuss the matter and see what we think should help this to change this esteem, not only in teaching, or what they perceived as in black schools, but whether in all the services, whether it's teaching, whether it's nursing, whether it's those sort of activities also.
Yeah, I think we have to address it nationally. And I'm very worried about this concept of social cohesion because it's crap. The reason I'm saying that is that social cohesion says, let's like each other, right? Let's do things to make sure we like each other, that there's peace. Now, social inclusion means as much as we like each other, but we're equal in resources and everything else. I'm not hearing the social inclusion part. And you cannot have national cohesion without both social cohesion and social inclusion. If you look at the structure of our economy, Africans are excluded. Africans and Amerindians are about 60% of this population. We own 5% or less of GDP. Now, if you're going to say to me, through social cohesion, we're all going to, be given the same opportunities, then you are not addressing past injustices, like why only a particular group was getting all the contracts. Why were they getting all the key positions? Why were they the ones who made all the policies? Why wasn't Clive Thomas part of the policy framework? So I'm saying social cohesion is nice. It's necessary. But it has to go with social inclusion. Don't tell me that I need to treat everybody equally, but when it comes to bread and butter issues, jobs, resources, land, contracts, that I'm still not getting it.
You touched on inclusion there, and it is true that I don't think the previous politicians understood what inclusion meant. Okay, and although I know there's the new goal of or new philosophical position of inclusion in the government, inclusion or inclusionary philosophy. Part of the problem is that one half of the society, that is the leaders of that other half of the society, Indian society, okay, I don't think they quite want to be involved in it. And this is a task I think we have to set that is ahead of us, that we have to just cross that hurdle. And how do we move out into inclusion?
But we have to be honest. Look at the national divide at the last elections. Are you telling me that the last 23 years of governance, that Indians didn't see some evilness in it? And yet, through the thematic approach of racism, they were able to, the PPP were able to keep them together in a block. So it wasn't about good governance, it's just that I don't want to be ruled by a black person. And it's deeper than that. If your religion teaches you that someone is inferior to you, you don't want that person to rule you. And so in this society, there are some other hooks that say to other people, black people aren't equal to you. And that's structural. It's deep in you because your religion is the thing that is your essence. And so we can talk all we want about social cohesion unless we deal with those structural issues that are deeply entwined in people's culture. We won't solve the problem. And
to solve the problem, one has to, in fact, make a move. For example, he mentions religion and so on and so forth. And it is true that they have this religious divide. And we are principally Christians, they are principally Hindus. Eh? But I think there will be respect for us who belong to that, are non-Hindus, okay? I'm thinking here principally of how do we make contact with Africa? How do we, how do we have exchanges with Africa? I'm talking of the cultural efforts that have to be made. I did, I knew I was coming to this program, and I did, for example, think that what have we done with sports, for example? No football team has ever come here. I was told that in a conversation today that in Burnham's time they actually had an Indian national football team that came to Guyana and played and had football in GCC. You heard about it?
We have the same thing. It's called the Indian cricket team.
Yes,
so had that.
So that, we're talking here how to overcome this cultural, the African Guyanese cultural.
But those things are cosmetic.
Yeah, but I mean, when you say cosmetic,
mm-hmm.
Okay. In terms of religion, okay, a lot of Indians had been wooed across from
Hinduism to
Christianity. And it is possible to change the religious, to change religion. I mean, that is not a big threat. Well, I shouldn't say it's not a big threat, but it is possible.
I think we have to take a strategic approach. We can't, on one hand, say that we need to be one people, with one nation, one destiny, if the Constitution itself says winner take all. So winner takes all means one group wins, the other group loses, whereas our motto says we're equal. So structurally, we have to change the Constitution so it's an enabling environment. Then we have to do something beyond that. We have to say, if you want me to be a Guyanese, let's define what a Guyanese is. This amorphous cultural thing called Guyanese, what is it? Let's define it, because it means different things to different people. Jamaicans had the 20 plan, and they said, what should we have? What is a Jamaican? A Jamaican has these attributes. We need to define that so we have a common goal. If not, we'll have different interpretations of what a Guyanese is. And underpinning those different interpretations will be different narratives. Even our history is corrupt in terms of truth. A lot of our history has been politically, how can I put it, snatched to reinforce these power differentials. So for example, you look through history and you see Africans, they're slaves. I am not a descendant of a slave.
Mm-hmm.
I came here, my ancestors came here enslaved. Mm-hmm. So even the language we have in our history makes people think that there is an inferiority pyramid, right?
But one's looking at the resolution of these matters. How do you I mean, you mentioned, for example, when you mentioned the matter of the Constitution, yes. I mean, how aren't we supposed to be looking efforts to resolve a resolution of how these things take place?
Yeah, but you have to define it so we have a common understanding of what the Guyanese is. And that's why there's this issue. Stop being Indo-Guyanese, stop being Afro-Guyanese, stop being Amerindian Guyanese. Okay, you want me to be Guyanese. What is that?
Guyanese. Okay, it's obvious that these issues are linked to political directorate because the constitution, for example, that has to be changed at the top level. So do you think that under this new government there will be conversations like these and more equality will be preached in the society, or will the suppression simply be moved away from African Guyanese and moved to another ethnic group?
But not I think in a coalition government that has no right.
Is it really a coalition government, or is it being called the coalition government?
But at least it's a partnership of some sort. You know, it's a partnership that brought it to power, and therefore I would think that they will strive to a large extent to bring about some sort of change where one can aim at being non-racial. Okay. And I think I agree that, you know, we probably have to come to some agreement of who is a Guyanese or what is, and so on. I mean, I remember when I was a boy, they used to call Britain a nation of traders, and everybody thought, well, that's who we are, you know. French was supposed to be like socialists and whatnot, and so on and so forth. But I think there are certain steps that has to be taken to move towards this non-racial thing. The Constitution is one way of doing so, but there are also other cultural things that have to take place that will bring about this balance. You know, I mentioned sport just now in terms of, but really I should really say exchanges. There got to be begin to have exchanges between here and Africa for Guyanese pride to begin to regain their pride. Okay. For me, I mean, I've traveled a lot and I've been into Africa quite a lot, okay? But the slave route still exists, okay? For you to go to Africa, you have to, it took me 30-something hours leaving Timeri to arrive at Port Harcourt in Nigeria. 32 hours. From the time the plane left Timeri to the time the plane arrived in Port Harcourt, okay? So that slave route still exists. How we change that? I think we change that with trade, if we can begin to trade with Africa, you know, and so on. And we change that with trade, we change that with exchanges. There have to be exchanges. I talked with somebody last week and we were stating that, listen, we don't even have an ambassador in Africa. That's political again, you know, the appointment of somebody like that into Africa. It's easier for Indians to travel to India or China than for Africans to travel to Africa.
Yeah, let me answer your question. Yes, we have a change in government, and there is this opportunity to do things differently. There's this opportunity to seek a non-racial society, because with the AFC and the APNU, there's that balance.
Yeah.
Now, central to this is the changing of the Constitution. I don't believe the Constitution is going to get changed easily, right? Because you need a 2/3 majority. And unless that Constitution is written in such a way that both sides, the 50-50 right now, because essentially that's how we're split, we're going to have problems. As a matter of fact, the Constitution can be held hostage as an attempt to break up the coalition through the Cummingsburg Accord. So I am not very hopeful about that. It depends on a lot of things. Now, in terms of African pride, I don't need to go to Africa. I mean, I've lived in Africa for 7.5 years. I've been to 40 African countries. I just need to go to Brazil to see my Africanness.
I don't agree with that.
Right? But coming to, and what we need more is not me going to Africa or Indians going to India. What I need is Buxton going to Lusignan and Enmore going to BV. And the school system, therefore, is the crucible of change. And central to that is truth. What is the truth about our history? Our history has been distorted and kidnapped to allow the politicians to manipulate us. So how we see each other is important. And currently our history and our religion makes us see each other as unequals. So until we sort that out locally, you know, because most Indians or Africans don't know African history or even Guyanese history. They don't know, for example, that 450,000 Africans died to build Guyana. They don't know, for example, that an African in 1838 in Guyana was worth 51 pounds versus the rest of the British colonies 17 pounds. They don't know that in 1838, Africans in Guyana were the most productive people in the entire British enslavement system. And it makes sense because we moved into the village movement, which was the greatest entrepreneurial activity in any post-slavery society. So, but we are viewed as lazy. When for 217 years, we built Guyana and died for Guyana and got nothing for it. So there needs to be this understanding of the contributions of Africa, and not that some people came and saved the sugar industry, because they didn't. We built it with our blood for 217 years. We dug 100 million tons of earth with our fingers to build Guyana. We cleared 15,000 square miles, or 18% of Guyana. Now, where in our education system is that information, so that not only are African kids proud of their history and don't think of themselves as descendants of slaves, but descendants of people who built Guyana?
I think he touched on another matter, the question of education. And education is, in fact, another tool that one can use in terms of resolving this matter of African pride, okay? I think we are fortunate also to have now a president who is a historian. And I think that one is likely to see the power of history coming to the fore in terms of bringing about change, okay? I mean, for example, only last week, I think the president was in Bartica, and he promised, or he declared that
1823 Bartica was declared to be a city.
Yeah, that next year by April next year, and he mentioned 178 years ago that the British did this. So, in terms of education, okay, there is the history, the power of history can do something in terms of pride and making African Guyanese feeling proud. It's a very interesting region too, that region 7, because that's the region that after the abolition of slavery, that's where the pork knockers went to look for gold. Now this is something.
Diversify the economy. We don't get credit for that.
Well, that's what we are not going to get credit for it. Okay? I'm talking here of how do you resolve these problems. Okay, I'm not only going to state the problem, and therefore, constitution, yes, education is another one, and the power of history. Now, I think what is problem also in the school system. I was at a conference yesterday where you can't have people majoring in history at UG, or they don't have. I think it's that
we don't
have. Okay.
Really, no.
And I remember an incident. I suspect that the teaching of history in Guyana is wrong in the sense that when I did sciences, so I'm basically science trained, but at secondary school I did some history, and I remember when we did history as cause and effect, right? And I think a lot of history now is done as names and dates. And I think if you do history as names and dates, it gets boring. I know nobody will want to do history. I had a experience once with a daughter who was in New York and was in school in New York. And when I mentioned to the teacher of history that in my time we did history as cause and effect, he said to me, that's a scientific way of studying history, right? And in fact, the other committee I nearly coughed him in his mouth because he said that, oh, your daughter's not there. But he was speaking because the girl was at school in a black area. And he even said to me that he teaches history different in Long Island than he teaches history in Brooklyn, as he escorted me out to the door, you know. So that I think, in fact, one of the things to resolve and to bring about this change, and we're here to talk about change in African Guyanese pride, is education, which Eric mentioned, constitution, the education, the exchanges, and the way in which we're going to resolve the question in education and what is taking place there. I think, for example, the new Minister of Education has a monumental, almost a Herculean task ahead of him, okay? That in terms of, for me, it's not only the, for example, I think you should pay teachers a higher salary than you pay civil servants because we need the very best to go into the teaching service, you know, the very best. And so when I speak also of the, when I spoke earlier of the service industries, education, nursing, service, you know, I think one has to put some more emphasis on that education thing that he mentioned so that we can resolve this matter of our pride and resolve this matter of how we look at ourselves, etc.
Okay, now that we have this, some suggestions on how to restore African Guyanese pride. What would this restoration do economically and politically for African Guyanese?
It must first do something spiritually for them.
Okay.
Because without the spirit, you know, that's the things of economics and whatnot and so it's not.
Which spirituality you're talking about? Christianity
No, well,
diminished our self-esteem.
yeah, but I mean, Christianity is only 200 years old. It could change easily.
Well,
I mean,
well, that's why I'm asking. But majority of Africans are Christians.
But they don't have to be Christians.
But they are.
Yes, but that's what we have to change.
How are you going to change that?
Talk to me, I'm a Rasta, so that I've already changed it.
Okay, so what will it do for them spiritually? What will this
Well,
restoration?
because it's a spirit that really leads you into development, into economics and whatnot and whatnot. If you don't have that inquisitive spirit, that those values of hope, those values of things, you know what I mean? Which then, in fact, we will continue to lag behind.
See, to me,
Christianity is really just a religion, it's a dramatization of belief. That's how we define religion, okay? And therefore, that drama could change. You know, no problem.
see, we have to first resolve this fundamental issue of identity. Are you Guyanese? Are you an African Guyanese? Are you an Indo-Guyanese? What are we trying to achieve? And no one is going to take away my definition of myself as African Guyanese. Because when I leave Guyana on a plane and go to any part of the world, they don't see me as Guyanese. They see me as African and they treat me like that. So to be delusional that I am not African in any way, shape, or form is folly. Right? So we have to define and we have to come to agreement that it's all right to be African Guyanese. It's all right to be Indo-Guyanese. I know the assimilalists are probably saying, no, we got to be Guyanese. Now, underpinning my identity is my culture. And my culture is not just cultural products, music and dance and food and all of that. My identity is directly linked to my spirituality. And that's one of the issues we don't address. We approach problems differently because of our spirituality and because of our religion. And so we have to address that. But African organizations have to be proactive in teaching truth, in teaching that we were the first people on this planet. Lucy in Ethiopia was alive 3.5 million years ago. Luzia in Brazil was alive 12,000 years ago before Amerindians were in Guyana. We came from great civilizations. We were the first mathematicians, doctors, agriculturalists, scientists. We were. And that hasn't left us because it's in our DNA. You know, we built the greatest structure in the world, a pyramid that is in the center of the landmass of this world. Right? So we have to first let our young people understand who they are and not to be defined by others as descendants of slaves. We created mathematics. You know, the Lubombo bones in Swaziland, it shows that 35,000 years ago, our ancestors were doing mathematics on the bones of baboons. Right? So Egypt was the greatest civilization, the cradle of civilization. We hear people saying that the Hippocratic Oath, right? That's a doctor, first do no harm. Hippocrates wasn't the father of medicine. It was Imhotep, who was born 2,000 years before him. We hear Pythagoras, the pi. They claim that he found pi. Well, 2,000 years before Pythagoras was born, pi was in the pyramids because the pyramids is about pi. You know, so George G.M. James, a Guyanese, who we don't know, who's probably the greatest intellect Guyana has ever produced, period, wrote Stolen Legacy. That should be required reading in our African community. So what I'm saying is that if you're going to say we are Guyanese, and there's no plank for me as an African kid, I don't have a history. My history is not from independence to now. My history is 3.5 million years old. And so I agree we need to be Guyanese, but I am forced African Guyanese than Guyanese, because in that's my identity, that's my culture, that's my DNA, and that's my essence. That's my brand.
Perhaps that's why Mr. Dalgety was suggesting the exchanges between Africa and Guyana.
I mean, I agree with all that he said, okay? And in fact, as I said, he's pointing to a new education, okay, in this quest of restoring our pride as African Guyanese, okay, which I support. I mean, all that Eric went, I agree that should be in the curriculum of our schools or among the black, the African-centered cultural organizations and so. So this education takes place, and it has to be continuous. It mustn't be a one-off thing, you know.
And a lot of what I'm saying there too is not African Guyanese history. It's Guyanese history. What we've done, we've created two narratives of our history instead of a single narrative that incorporates a lot of those things. Most Indo-Guyanese don't know African Guyanese history because they're thinking about when they came here as indentured servants. Well, we were here 217 years before, and we created Guyana. Here's a simple manifestation of that. Who's the father of Guyana? It can't be Chetty Jagan. It can't be Janet Jagan. It's not even Forbes Burnham. It's Cuffy.
I think that point is a valid point. Okay, that because I think, for example, when you think of the beginning of nations, you probably have to begin with 1763 monument, for example, and what placed the monument, what's the place of the monument in the psyche of our being as Guyanese. Yeah?
Because
talking about that, I myself am hoping one of these days that I mean, I was at the funeral of Philip Moore, and I know that we all wanted him to be buried at 7 Ponds, and I'm hoping that some effort will be made to restore him and to bring him back into this. There was another incident here that took place under the PAP that was pretty lousy. Gail Teixeira, who removed Burnham's portrait from the Natural Culture Center, she had a big battle with Ting the Regular. You remember him?
Yeah.
Can't remember his name now. Anyhow, and you know, it has to be a very mean person, mean mind, right? Who is going to take down a portrait of Burnham at the Cultural Center and find an excuse for not putting it back. So I think that when you're talking about restoring African pride and so on and so forth, some of these steps, maybe simple steps, should be made. Okay, Philip Moore, greatest artist I think we have. You ever saw his Jumbie wedding? In the go to the art gallery and look at Jumbie wedding. Fantastic painting.
But here's the work we have to do.
No, I'm talking of restoring.
No,
the steps.
I'm agreeing with
restore,
you. Look how Burnham was demonized in the last election. There was the PPP strategy was to demonize him.
It's part of their meanness, and we gotta,
this
person would be a mean set of.
But that meanness was an education for the Indian community. They never said he did any good. And so, what I'm trying to say is that until we have an agreed upon common narrative, education starts in the home.
Between the political people or between cultural...
Politicians can't solve our problem.
No, you said a common narrative between
historians. Our historians have to come together.
You have to learn to teach history
to my
in the first place.
Point, we can't expect the government to solve this problem. This is a people problem. They can put structures in place. And even if the Constitution changes, somebody could still go to an election and preach racism and separatism. So the process, the systems have to be in place, and then there have to be a civil society moral code about equality. We need a Bill of Rights to go with the Constitution. And civil society has to strengthen itself because they're the actors, they're the change agents that will underpin any structural constitutional change or any other
Civil society?
Let's talk about, since we're on civil society, let's talk about some organizations in Guyana that have been a part of this restoration. We know there's Cuffy250 that goes into African Guyanese communities, and Mr. Phillips, you're a part of ACDA.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about some of the work that ACDA has been doing to restore African Guyanese, African cultural?
Well, let me start with three main festive events, and then I'll do the other things. Emancipation. Again, that is a critical process. People have to understand that because emancipation is linked to enslavement. African Holocaust Day, which is October 12th, the day Columbus came with this, we lost so many lives, so we remember them. Kwanzaa, which to me is a way of us changing our value system. So we do those. But the school to me is more fundamental, where we teach self-pride, we teach self-independence. We're creating leaders that are centered in their spirituality and in their culture. We interact with about 14 different groups, 14 different communities. We've had a TV program for the last 19 years.
Not a very good one.
Well, that's your perspective. So we interact with international groups. So at Emancipation, we bring in groups from Brazil, Suriname, the United States. We've had groups from Trinidad, Barbados, Jamaica. So those are some of the things. We have a new youth center. And critical for us, and I hope all African groups listen to this, we're too old. Bring in the young people, do succession planning. I've gone to some African organizations where I'm the youngest person. That's madness. And again, it's part of our culture. This is a culture that is of ageism and sexism. And we have to change that. We have to empower our youth. We have to transition our youth. We have to nurture them. We have failed our youth. And our organizations need to realize that and to start regenerating that if we are to survive.
Okay. Can you pinpoint any organizations?
Well, I've been supporting Rastafari.
Tom has been in about 15 organizations. I mean, which I congratulate him because when we had
Can I speak, please?
the memorandum.
Yes, you may.
I was part of this is true for many years, and in fact, there are some things that have left in ACDA that I think I could claim. You know. But I've been mostly supporting Rastafari activities over the past 15, 20 years, frankly speaking. And there are the two major events in the Rastafari Canada. One's coming up this month on the 23rd of July, which is the Haile Selassie.
Yes,
And one is the coronation in November the 2nd. I'm showing a film here. And the difference between, let us say, our part of our contribution in the restoration, okay, is that we, within the Rastafari, mainly focus on Africa, okay? Mainly because we look to Haile Selassie as King of Kings, Lord of Lights. And therefore, not only on many occasions, we in fact have what we call bingi, and at various villages throughout the country. And right now we are even restoring our drums, etc., and so on and so forth. So our focus here as a Rastafari group really is more to do with Africa than to do with what I call Black America or that sort of thing. That's our focus.
Okay. We've been speaking a lot about Guyana. But do you think that the problem is isolated to Guyana, or is it a problem throughout the world where African cultural pride needs restoration?
I would think so, right? And it needs restoration in a very bad way. I know there was an attempt to do something called the African Renaissance, I think, out of South Africa. Yeah, although there's been some criticism about it that they're trying to Europeanize Africa. I know there's a problem in Africa itself. Like there's problems I imagine in many other racial groups, but I mean we are concentrated mainly in Africa. I know there is the present situation where there's talk from my travels, okay, that the Arabs are trying to colonize Africa, which
It is true.
which is true. I mean, it is for you to be a member of the Arab League, all you have to do is speak Arabic, you know, and that makes you a member.
Which is
and
the largest spoken language,
you know,
in Africa.
well, yeah, might be, you
Yeah.
know, I know that, and so on. So there is, but see, it is our duty, I should think, to in fact to go to Africa and help to turn it around. I mean, for example, take the famous Pan-African movement, okay? The Pan-Africanists that really turned around, began to turn around Africa, came from the diaspora, you know? There was a famous, well,
Garvey.
as he mentioned, Caribbean diaspora, Garvey, Padmore,
C.L.R.
C.L.R. James,
Dunbar,
right down to Walter Rodney, you know what I mean?
Bob
Bob Marley, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And therefore, it is still our duty, I would say, to in fact return to Africa. That's very Garveyite, a phrase I use there, and to help in the restoration of African pride, even within Africa itself. This is why I when I first began the program, we spoke about trade. There's this phenomena right now of Africans running away from Africa and dying in the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the thing is absurd.
Yeah.
You know, so that I think if one can begin to trade with Africa, then it will open up this two-way connection between the diaspora and Africa. Okay.
Africa is strong and powerful. There are 3,000 tribes in Africa. They speak 2,000 languages. I lived in South Africa. You had the Zulus, 9 tribes. Zulu culture in itself is extraordinarily powerful. You go to West Africa, the Ashanti, you go to Mali, the Dogon. There's such incredible diversity. What hasn't happened is that we don't know about African culture. And what Africa needs to do, the way the Caribbean did with reggae and Rastafari, Africa needs to export its culture. I had an interesting lunch one day when I was in the States. And I was going to an Indian restaurant with a friend of mine, and with a white gentleman. And I said to him, next time I'll take you to an African restaurant. And he essentially didn't want to go. And ultimately what I realized is that people only eat the food of cultures that they see to be superior to them. So everybody's rushing to eat Chinese food, Japanese food, and all of that. So there are some things that we have to do globally, because globally we're seen as still at the bottom of the race pyramid because of colonialism and a lot of things. But Africa is extraordinarily rich. We just have to market it and brand it differently.
And this is one reason why I began speaking about exchanges. We have to begin to do exchanges. Exchanges at the education level, at the cultural level, at the level of sports, and so on. If the goal is to restoration, if the goal is just marking time and staying at the bottom of the belt.
But locally,
You know?
we need
But I
to
think-
put up Eddie Grant's image all over the country. We need to put up our friend who is buried at Seven Ponds, who did the 1763. We have heroes that should be role models for young people. And they're not even there. You go to Jamaica, every block is Bob Marley. Every other block is Marcus Garvey. Every other block is Nani. Where are our heroes? Heroes drive self-esteem. And we need to start doing that regardless of who's upset.
Okay. And I think this is a good note to end on, because we are officially out of time. So thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Dalgety, and thank you, Mr. Phillips, for being on African Drums and enlightening me, as well as our viewers, on the restoration of African culture in Guyana.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, viewers, thank you for staying with us. I have one announcement. There is the annual Cuffy250 Emancipation Forum. It's on the 10th of August, and it's beginning at 10:30 a.m. It's at Critchlow Labor College. More information will be available as we get closer to the date, but just mark it on your calendar. It's the Cuffy250 Emancipation Forum. It's the 9th. Sorry, it's the 9th,
The 9th.
of August. So mark that date on your calendar, 9th
Sunday?
of August. Yes, the Cuffy250 Emancipation Forum. Please make special effort to attend. Thank you for watching African Drums, the television organ of the Cuffy250 Committee, an organization dedicated to the empowerment of the African Guyanese community through education and the encouragement of self-activity. Please like our Facebook page, it's Cuffy250. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, also Cuffy250. Send us an email and donate to the cause. It's Cuffy250gy@gmail.com. I am Elsie Harry. See you next time.